Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, shalom. It is such a pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming. I want to first and foremost tell you what a privilege it is to be here with you, and I want to thank the Jewish Community Foundation for having brought me here, and for the American-Israel Friendship League, who first and foremost teamed me up with Prescott, because the community here I'm falling in love with. The representatives you sent to Israel that I had the great privilege and pleasure of meeting in October are such an example of this entire city. In my short 2 days here, almost 2 days here, I'm very impressed with everything I see, and I can feel the friendship and warmth from you. And thank you for having me here. Thank you, Pastor Lee and Pastor Dan, for having me at your services this morning. I thoroughly enjoyed them. And I hope that you're going to get a little bit out of this evening, because I intend this evening to share a little with you of the challenges that are facing Israel. They are many. Israel, our tiny country, is faced with many challenges, and tonight I want to share with you a little of the dilemmas, the present situation that we're in, and of course, also the great hopes we have. First and foremost, let me try and give you a little bit of a geography lesson as to where our little country, Israel, is in this tiny slither of land. So tiny, in fact, that our name has to be out at sea. Incidentally, that's where many of our neighbors would like to put us. And it's a darn good thing that we Jews are not swimmers. You know, there are exceptions, Mark Spitz for one, but we Jews are generally non-swimmers, and we want to stay out of that water. So we struggle to hold that slither of land that is, you could describe a land bridge between the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Babylon by the Euphrates. Surrounded by generally hostile countries, even though today, and this just shows that we're on the improve, we have a peace agreement with our neighbor Jordan, a peace agreement with our neighbor Egypt, a cold peace, but many have intelligently said a cold peace is better than a warm war. The borders of Israel, if I may just give you a very quick geography lesson. Our northern border with Lebanon, our northeastern border with Syria. This is the Golan Heights, a patch of land that could quite correctly be called occupied territory, because Syria lost it to Israel in the War of 1967, the Six-Day War. Our longest border begins at the very southern end of the Sea of Galilee, that lake where so many of the miracles and the ministry of Jesus is carried out. A wonderful area. That southern point of the Sea of Galilee is where the Jordan River leads on its way to the Dead Sea, and all the way from the Dead Sea is a rift that leads to the southernmost point of Israel, our longest border with what is today Jordan. Our straightest border, drawn by British ordnance officers, is between Egypt and Israel, and our friendliest border, the Mediterranean. There are 3 patches of land that I'm going to concentrate on, 2 of them at least, and one in more detail when we talk about the challenges facing Israel. And the 3 patches, this one I'm not going to deal with unless we have questions about it afterwards. It's going to be currently in the news, the Golan Heights. The West Bank, a euphemism for a bulge of land that bulges around both sides of Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, that tiny strip there. We're going to deal in more detail with those. In order to understand where we are today, we have to understand the changing borders of Israel in modern times. And the best place to start would be, if we are not going to go all the way back, the best place to start is with the end of the First World War and the British mandate in what was called Palestine. Incidentally, many people don't realize that the name Palestine is not a new name. It actually was first used by the Romans in 135 AD by Hadrian, who thought that the name Judea was too Jewish. And when he suppresses the Second Jewish Revolt, he changes the name of the land to Palestine. And thus, the Palestinians of today are getting their name from the land that was called in honor of the Philistines, who had long disappeared from history. But when the British take over this area in 1917, the area of Palestine divided the Turks, who lose the First World War, have their area divided between the French and the British. The Russians, of course, are too busy with the revolution, and thus the land is divided. The British get the mandate over Palestine. Now, here was the great hope of the Jewish people, that at long last, the streams of Jews who were coming into the land from the mid-1800s already, and towards the end of the 1800s, results of the pogroms in Eastern Europe, thought finally, under the British administration, this declaration, the Balfour Declaration, allowing the Jews to have a country they could call their own, would come into being. This was the great hope. Unfortunately, it was not to be without a long, difficult struggle. The first dashing of the hope was in 1921, the British carving the entire Transjordan area, making a new country out of it called Jordan. This was partially in payment of Lawrence of Arabia's assistance in the war. But, you know, the Jews in the remaining area said, okay, a great chunk of the biblical part of Israel is now out of bounds, but what is left will be enough, and we can establish our state there. That was not to be either. That was not to be. There were restrictions on Jewish immigration, and of course, after the Second World War, when the horrific events of the Holocaust come to light, and the knowledge that 1/3 of the Jewish population was wiped out by the Nazis, murdered, there comes a realization worldwide, not just a Jewish realization, but a worldwide realization that the Jews need one tiny strip of land on God's earth that they can call their own, that they can defend for themselves, that they don't need permission to come into. You know, we Jews, we Israelis of today, make a very, very clear and loud statement that whatever it takes, we will ensure there is one tiny strip of land where the Jews have control of their own destiny. Why? Because we remember the terrible price that we paid for not having a country of our own. We remember the world's reaction, even countries that are friendly, when asked, how many Jews would you accept to save them from the Holocaust? You may remember friendly countries reply, Canada, foreign minister, who said none is too many. Why should we import problems? So it became very clear to us that we had to have one strip of land on God's earth where no restrictions apply, where the gates are open for every Jew. At the same time, we make a determined statement that whatever it takes, this Jewish state will also be a democratic state. And the third and strongest declaration, never again. Never again, as long as there is a Jewish state, will we allow a Jew to be taken to the slaughter just because he's a Jew. With all that in mind, the struggle against the British mandate to have one tiny area of land where the Jews would be responsible for their own destiny continues to the point where the British mandate is handed over to the newly formed United Nations, saying, take the problem, sort it out, it's too complicated, and the United Nations comes up. I'm skipping a lot, okay? There were other plans before this one, but the United Nations adopts a plan called the Partition Plan. The Partition Plan divides the areas, the darker area here, 3 enclaves, and the lighter area, another 3 enclaves, between the Jews and the Arabs in this tiny strip of land that is left. The lighter areas for the Jews, decided upon mainly by demographic reasons, and the darker area for the Arabs. Jerusalem, intended to remain an internationally governed city. Guess what? Israel says, we'll take it. It was much, much, much less than was hoped for, much less than dreamed for, but it was something. We'll take it. The Arabs, however, had a very different reaction. No way, not 1 square inch. And this caused, of course, as soon as Israel, on the 14th of May, 1948, in a art museum in Tel Aviv, when David Ben-Gurion, against the advice of all the leaders of the world, the most friendly countries, decides that we've waited 2,000 years, we're not waiting any longer, we have the window of opportunity, and we're going to declare our state. We're advised by everyone, by our best friends, yourselves. Don't do it. They're waiting to pounce on you. You're so small, you're so tiny. You won't survive. We've just gone through a Second World War. We're not going to be able to help you too much. Guess what? David Ben-Gurion said, we waited 2,000 years. We can wait no longer. This causes, as soon as Israel is declared, the outbreak of what we call the War of Independence. You know, David Ben-Gurion first said it, Golda Meir paraphrased, and it's such a wonderful statement because there's no other explanation, really no other explanation. In Israel, if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. At the conclusion of the War of Independence, Israel ends up with more territory than the partition plan allowed for. The Jordanians cross the border and manage to grab hold of a chunk of land bulging around Jerusalem that we call euphemistically the West Bank. You can call it Judea and Samaria as well, because that's the land of the Bible, but we euphemistically call it the West Bank. So the Jordanians take control of this. The Egyptians manage to hold on to the Gaza Strip, and the rest of it, a contiguous landmass, becomes the borders of Israel after the War of Independence. At long last, there is a livable and governable area, and Israel reaches out to the Arab nations saying, accept us, we can live in harmony beside each other. That was not to come. Instead, in 1967, after much harassment, Israel is attacked on all fronts. Totally outgunned, outnumbered. On all fronts, the tiny country, once again, if you don't believe in miracles, you just can't understand what happened. You just cannot explain what happened. The bookmakers in London, I think, were giving 3-1 on that Israel wouldn't survive a week. And in less than a week, in 6 days, look at what happened. Miraculously. The Jordanians are pushed back across their international border. The Syrians who harassed Israel from the Golan Heights lose the Golan Heights to Israel. And the Egyptians are not only pushed out of Gaza, but out of the entire Sinai Peninsula. An absolutely amazing result, a totally incredible result. We spoke about a cold peace being much nicer than a warm war, and so it is. And the peace, incidentally, with Egypt has proved itself. Through difficult times, it has proved itself. In 1982, we signed after Sadat's brave journey to the Knesset and Jerusalem. We signed a peace agreement with Egypt, withdrawing to the international border, every last square inch. We begged them to take the Gaza Strip back as well, but they knew why they refused. And we were stuck with it. We'll come to that. We signed, not long after that, a peace agreement with Jordan. A quick recapping. The first map will show you the Jewish settlement in the land in the days of Palestine after Transjordan. We'll show you the partition plan. We'll show you the results of the War of Independence, and then the results of the Six-Day War. As I said, we inherited the Gaza Strip in the Six-Day War and the West Bank. You know, David Ben-Gurion, who in the future I'm sure will read like a prophet, after the war, he was still alive and he lived until after the next war, 1973, the October War, the Yom Kippur War. He said, "Great job, guys," to the army. "Great job. Keep the Golan Heights. No civilians there, and it's a very important strategic area that will stop future Syrian incursions. Unite Jerusalem, never to be divided again, but get out of everywhere else fast." Well, we didn't take the advice, and we were stuck with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. We thought, at long last, now we have cards to negotiate, to make a peace with our neighbors. We have territory to offer them. Of course, you may remember the Khartoum conference with the 3 no's. No talks, no peace, no Israel. And from 67 until 73, the next war, Israel's living in euphoria. We've conquered it all. We start settling in the Golan Heights, in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and all is well with the world. But you know, that's when we sometimes get the wake-up call, and our wake-up call was the October War, the Yom Kippur War. It was a difficult war. It was, you know, if you talk about Miracles, the Yom Kippur War, coming out of it in one piece with an Israel still intact was another miracle, but we won't go into that now. We had the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and these areas festered. We tried to deal in the same way as we dealt with Jordan and with Egypt. Negotiation with the Palestinians. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Oslo Accords, Camp David, and we were getting there, and we really believed, we had such optimism that we were going to be able to have two states side by side, a state that would be Palestine, a Palestinian state, and a Jewish state. But the ex-leader of the Palestinians, Yasser Arafat, had other ideas. Because from the idea of a two-state solution that was at one stage actually mouthed as acceptable by our neighbors, suddenly became not necessary. Strategically, if the present situation continues indefinitely, then there doesn't need to be a two-state solution. There will be a one-state solution, and it won't be Jewish. This caused Israel to realize that it's either coming to an accommodation with the Palestinians and our neighbors, because if we want to, and we will at all cost, remain a democratic state and a Jewish state, then we need clearly defined borders. Arrangements to get to clearly defined borders came to a total blow-up when Yasser Arafat launched what I like to call the War of Terror. It's sometimes called the Temple Mount Intifada. I'm sure you're familiar with the stated reason why it started. Our now hospitalized Prime Minister Arik Sharon's visit on the Temple Mount was used as the excuse for the launching of a war of terror that lasted 6 years. This war of terror was very difficult to deal with. You know, you didn't want to turn on the radio in the morning because you'd hear a bus blown up. A restaurant, you clean up the mess, and then again the next day, and again, and of course, we had it up to here. Your group of delegates had the opportunity to meet with the two gentlemen, an Israeli Arab and an Israeli Jew, in the Gilboa area, who actually initiated what was resisted by the entire political spectrum, the government, the opposition, the in-betweens, the creation of a barrier, a fence, and where necessary, wall, to protect our citizens from these outrages. It began as a regional thing. Because, you know, you can quite understand this. The right didn't want a fence or border, barrier, because it could be a border. And you mean we're relinquishing everything on the other side of it? We don't want to. The left, of course, says build bridges, not fences. But the population said, we want to keep these guys who are causing this out. And thus, initiated by these two gentlemen, Israel opted for a security anti-terror fence. And, where necessary, war. This is one of the most misunderstood things that Israel has done, really misunderstood, and I'm going to try in a few moments to try and clear it up for you. Because the use of the word war was a tremendous success on the part of the Palestinian propaganda machine. The entire barrier, that is an anti-terror barrier, will be no more than 4.5%, 5% wall. At this stage, it's much less. Eventually, when all is complete, it'll be 4.5%, 5% wall. Guess what? We much more prefer fence. The irony of it is a wall is much less smart, much uglier, and a fence is much smarter, more discreet, but also more permanent. It costs more to put a fence than the wall because the fence is a smart fence. The wall is a dumb wall. We decided to create this barrier. We decided to create this barrier along the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And I have to tell you that in the Gaza Strip, the fence was first completed with passage points that incidentally are constantly attacked. These passage points that give relief to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are targeted. You know why? Because the people in charge don't want a good relationship. They don't want their people to have a better life, because if they did, then they'll accept an Israel alongside of them. And that's not their intent. But guess what? The fence around the Gaza Strip made 100% effective the stopping of terrorists, suicide bombers coming into Israel. And thus the lessons were learnt, and quite quickly we tried to create and have created more than about 2/3 of it complete already. Security boundary, mostly fence around the West Bank. Now, I said smart fence. You're seeing a diagram here. The fence works in the following manner. If you were looking at it from any more than 100 meters, you probably wouldn't even notice it. It's a chicken wire fence of about 2.3 meters with electronics, not electric. You can shake the fence, you can climb it, nothing will happen to you. Just alarms will sound in the control rooms, and the Israeli patrol on that road will come very quickly to deal with any intrusions. Of course, there are passage points in this fence where those with OKs can come in to work in Israel, and so on. We realize, of course, and I have to tell you this, that this is not convenient. It separates sometimes a Palestinian on the West Bank from the option of crossing into Israel to a clinic. It separated, in some cases, children who were on either side of Israeli Arab villages and Palestinian Arab villages from going across into schools. And it's inconvenient for everybody. But guess what? It stops the terror. It has been so effective in stopping the terror that we, without hard hearts, because we feel that, it's terrible that innocent people are inconvenienced, but inconvenience is better than having 3 generations of a family blown up in one bomb blast in the center of Jerusalem, in the Sbarro restaurant, where grandparents, parents, and children were killed in one bombing. So, the fence it is. This is an actual picture of a section of the fence. The way it works is a barrier, a smart electronic fence, and then a patrol road on the other side. Okay, so where does the wall come in? You can see that this takes space, the fence. It's a smart system. Where you don't have the space, you need to have a barrier, and you need it to be hard to penetrate, so it's wall. In the areas where space is restricted, you have, and I need to prepare you for this, ugly wall. We don't like it, but we love it. We don't like it because it's ugly. We love it because it's saving lives. That's it. Sections of tall concrete slabs linked together. Guess what? It is not It doesn't have to be permanent. It is placed so easily by being lowered into the site in slots by cranes, and the same way it is placed, it can be removed. All that needs to happen to have the removal of these ugly concrete structures is for them not to be needed. Not to be needed because no longer are people coming across to blow up Israelis, Jews in restaurants or shopping malls. Then they can be easily removed. I mentioned that we love it, this fence and wall, because it's saving lives. I just want to show you the suicide bombing attacks during the 6 years of confrontation, and of course, it lapped into 7 and 8. Look at how it goes up, 4, 35, 60, the peak. And that's when we had the Operation Defensive Shield. You may recall that there were talks of a massacre in Jenin, another total fabrication where Israel paid heavily with the best of its military crack squads, killed because we wanted there to perform a surgical operation of removing a cancerous growth in the middle of the refugee camp in Jenin. And we paid dearly because we didn't want to harm the surroundings. And yet we were accused totally ludicrously of massacre in Jenin. But the Operation David's Shield caused a drop, but the major drop in the terror was the beginnings of the construction of the fence. Here is where it was in the Gilboa, here is where it started to spread, and here is where only one third of the fence was completed in 2006, and suicide bombs were restricted to, from the height of 60 to 4. Today, in the last 2 years, in the last year, 1. And the fence is not yet completed. At the same time, here we have another graphic illustration of, in the green, the suicide successes, and in the blue, the prevented. Why is that fence working? It's working not because you cannot break through a fence. Of course you can climb a fence. There's no such thing as a wall or a fence that will keep a determined person out. But it will give a warning. And if you have enough time with that warning, you can stop the perpetrator. I could tell you stories of suicide bombers since the fence being completed. One blowing up on the wrong side of the fence, and we thought at first, accident, work accident. He pre-detonated the bomb or something went wrong. Only a week after that, a suicide bomber walked up to the Israeli guard point at the fence and said, hey, I've left my suicide belt over there. I'm not going to blow myself up. I don't want to die for nothing. I want to kill Jews, but I can't. And I don't want to go back a failure alive, and I don't want to blow myself uselessly. Take me. That's when it became very clear that the fence was working perfectly. However, here we have, again, a very clear visualization of the lives lost in these attacks, dropping down to today almost zero. You know, I mentioned we're determined to remain a Jewish state and a democratic state, which means that we cannot continue indefinitely to rule another people. We either have to make them Israeli citizens, all 1.2 million of them in the West Bank and another close to 1 million in the Gaza Strip, and then we won't in short time be a Jewish state, or we have to divorce ourselves of them and have them live alongside us in a state of their own. Well, the beginnings was Gaza. We totally and absolutely went out of every last square millimeter of the Gaza Strip. With world support, hothouses were left behind for them, intact, to make a living. At their request, the Palestinian Authority's request, houses were plowed down because the Palestinian Authority was worried about the fighting of who would get what. But we left every last square centimeter of Gaza, and what we got was this. Rockets. At first, the primitive Qassam rockets, and now, smarter and smarter, the Grad that are hitting as far as Ashkelon. Primitive or not, when they land in the wrong place, they kill, and they do a lot of damage. And these are pictures of the effects of rockets from the Gaza Strip. In contrast to the other graph I showed you, here we have the slow but steady increase in the rockets sent over from the Gaza because they can't send suicide bombers over. So they send rockets. There's a yearly, in 1 year, a monthly count. Look at that. 191 just in July of 2 years ago. 191. Today, 3 a day, 5 a day. Every day it's happening. You don't hear it in the news. It's not news anymore. It's a daily event. We're talking about the Gaza Strip. But now, look at the West Bank. We totally and absolutely went out of the Gaza Strip. Our intention, and Arik Sharon saw this very clearly, if we want to remain a Jewish state and a democratic state, we would have to do the same with the West Bank. We would have to maybe not vacate 100% of it, because there are large Jewish settlements on the edges of the West Bank that we would incorporate. And of course, with negotiation, Israel would be prepared to deal with the Palestinians for land exchanges to allow them a little more space around Gaza, perhaps. And the idea was that we would do what we did in Gaza in most of the West Bank. Unilaterally withdraw, giving them one contiguous area. They would manage their affairs, we would manage our affairs. If they would cooperate, we would cooperate, we could have peace, it could be paradise on earth. And then we have the Gaza experiment that totally failed. And we have to now stop and think, wait a minute, can we afford to withdraw from the West Bank? Look at where these cities are in the West Bank. Look at where Jerusalem is. Look at where Tel Aviv is. 11 miles. The airport, 3 miles, 4 miles from the West Bank. Can you imagine Qassams, mortars? They wouldn't even need Qassams falling in the airport, and our one and only international airport. So we had to stop and rethink. Wait a minute. Can we afford to withdraw from the West Bank, totally withdraw from the West Bank? On one hand, we need to. We absolutely have to, for our own good, for their good as well. And on the other hand, if the same happens as happened in Gaza, where do we go from there? Do we re-invade? You know, I've heard this example many, many times of what any country, take your country for instance, would do in the face of someone outside the borders of the country bombarding your country daily. Just for example, and I don't want to cause any international incidents here, Mexico or Canada would start sending rockets into Buffalo. The next question would be, what Canada? No sovereign country would tolerate it. And yet we do. And yet we do. And the reason we do is we realize that there are many, many innocents who would be hurt in any massive reaction. So we bite our lips and we grit our teeth and we hang on and we hope that it'll change. And when we get that hit on the head, as we did when we launched Operation David's Shield after the Passover massacre, where 2 suicide bombers walked into a Passover Seder, families sitting around, and blew themselves up, killing many. That's when we say, that's it, we react. And we also react, folks, with a great deal of restraint. That perhaps, and here I have to be careful with what I say because I don't want to get too political, but that perhaps might have been our mistake in the last Lebanon war. Reacting with too much restraint. You know, I have spoken about some of the challenges facing Israel. I never even touched the tip of the iceberg. I've spoken about the major challenge. How are we going to remain a democratic and a Jewish state at the same time when we have to figure out a way to divorce ourselves from the West Bank? We've divorced ourselves from Gaza. We have to figure out how to deal with their constant bombardment of Israel. These are challenges facing us. I didn't even mention the enormous challenge of that guy in Iran who wants to push us into the sea or not have us around at all. I didn't mention the complicated issues with the Golan Heights. We are faced with a whole range of problems, of challenges. But guess what? We've never had it better. We've never been in a stronger position than ever before. So there is a lot of optimism. Who would have imagined? Who would have imagined 4 or 5 years, 3 years in some cases, after the liberation of Jews from death camps, from the Holocaust, that a country, a state of Israel, would be born on the 14th of May, 1948. And when it was born, who would imagine it would survive? And yet it did. The only explanation, miraculous. I said we've never had it better. Today, we have a government of our own. That's the House of Parliament. The symbol of Israel, Exodus 26. You will fashion a candlestick with 3 branches from one side, 3 branches from the other side, that lit the very entrance to the house of the Lord. Our national symbol proudly stands. We have our own Air Force, a Jewish Air Force. Your planes, a little bit of our technology, but we have our own Air Force, and we're able to defend ourselves. We produce our own tanks. I wish it wasn't necessary, but that's not the reality today. And despite it all, we haven't neglected the other aspects of life. The technology. We're at the forefront of desalination. I don't know if you know this or not, but in the field of medicine, Israel has contributed, it's this tiny country, stem cell technology. detection of breast cancer without radiation, scanning devices in some of the fields of medicine, advances contributed to world medicine by Israel, this tiny country. I don't know how many of you realize that ICQ was invented in Israel. You know those annoying things that buzz in your pockets and ring? Guess where they came from? This tiny country of Israel. Despite it all, despite all the challenges, despite all the struggles, Israel is doing its share, contributing to the world, desperately trying to remain humane, just, in the face of incredible hostility, in the face of rockets being launched at her every day, and yet the miracles. City of Tel Aviv, 100 years ago, all you would have seen there was sand dunes. 100 years ago, a new city stands where there were sand dunes. And guess what? We live our lives well. Beaches, so it ain't all bad. And just recently, we celebrated our 60th anniversary. Who would have thought? In 1948, on the 14th of May, many weren't giving Israel a lifespan of a week. And yet, here we are today, stronger than ever before, with enormous challenges facing us. But you know, we've had challenges before. We have to do our part, of course. But as I said, this is the land of miracles. Israel, if you don't believe in miracles, you're just not a realist. So we'll see you next year in Jerusalem, right? No, we'll go.